On January 9th, 2017, Dan Primack dropped this BFD in his first Axios newsletter. Since then, we've covered a lot of deals, over 10,000. M&A deals, VC deals, private equity deals, growth capital, IPOs, and more. If you work in deal making, you know it can be a lot to keep track of. That's why now we're launching Deals Tracker, a new feature exclusively for Axios Pro. Deals Tracker uses AI to read and consolidate our coverage, giving you the information you need about the deals that matter to you. Here's how it works. Every deal we've reported on has been added to a new searchable archive, and every deal we cover in the future will be added too. The Deals Tracker gives you quick access to deal history for companies and investors across a variety of industries. You can easily narrow your research, focusing on the things that you care about. The tool lets you easily see different deal types to understand who's raising money, who's buying or selling, who's merging, or big personnel moves. The search results are concise and easy to read, giving you the most important information in seconds. But if you need to dig deeper, you'll be able to download deal data or explore our in-depth reporting, giving you context to why deals happened. When you combine the utility of the Deals Tracker with the analysis and expertise from our industry-leading journalists, Axios Pro now offers the most helpful toolkit available to the modern deal maker. All Axios Pro Deal subscribers get instant access to Deals Tracker. Subscribe today at axiospro.com.
Welcome aboard.
Please welcome to the stage Axios World Editor Lauren Whitney Gottbreath.
Good morning. I'm Lauren Whitney Gottbreath, the World Editor at Axios. I'm thrilled to be here with you today to have a conversation on this incredibly important topic, how the role of policy can help reduce hunger. If you're following along virtually, you can join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag AxiosEvents. Now I'd like to welcome our first guest, the CEO of Mercy Corps, Jada Doyen McKenna. Jada, thank you so much for being here today. Before we get into sort of policy and solution-oriented topics, I want to first sort of set the stage of the global hunger crisis worldwide. And unfortunately, as we know, the last month has seen some news that isn't great in terms of the fight for global hunger. With Russia's decision to pull out of the grain initiative, the Black Sea Grain Initiative, What are humanitarian groups like Mercy Corps fearing as you head into what could ultimately be a really difficult time in the work that you guys are doing?
First of all, thank you for having me, and thank you all for being interested in coming and highlighting this important issue. It's unfortunately, it's one that we've had to keep talking about more and more, and it's great to see that engagement. Should I set the context first, or talk about what we're worried about right now? So I want to go back in history a little bit, because I think it'll help set the stage for where we are now. So before Russia invaded Ukraine, we had already seen the numbers of severely hungry and hungry people going up because of COVID, the disruptions in trade or in shipping. And so you already had people who were seriously in peril. The Horn of Africa was in its 5th season of failed rain. So we already were kind of nearing famine-like conditions in the Horn of Africa. Yemen, World Food Program, and others were sounding the alarm that the food supplies had become really expensive. And then Russia decides to invade one of the world's bread baskets. Many countries in the Middle East and Africa depended on grain from Ukraine. Ukraine was responsible before the war for about 30% of the world exports of grain, also critical supplies of sunflower oil, other things. And Russia and Ukraine combined are also a critical source of fertilizer. So immediately after the war started, we saw prices spike up almost immediately. I think there was just this huge fear in the market around, things were already bad. This is a major supply chain that's going to be cut off, fertilizers. So last year, there was a price issue, and our fear always was that this year there would be a food availability issue, because even now, since the war started, farming is hard work, and when your farms are being bombed, a lot of farmers have abandoned their farmlands. They weren't farming. So in the midst of all that, when the grain deal came along, Ukraine was still able to export enough to feed about 40 million people a year. Now that's a third of what they were exporting before, but it was really wonderful to have that grain on the market, and the market understood that stabilization, and we'd come to a place. So I think now you're looking at another market shock on top of what we knew was already less availability than before from people not farming last year. And this is harvest season in Ukraine. So farmers will have just harvested their grains in June and July. And then this morning, we heard of actual bombings at the port in Odessa, which is a major supply. So we're all holding our breaths. Like when the announcement about the end of the deal came up last week, we saw an immediate spike in some futures prices. We'll see what the long-term impact is, but this is an unwelcome shock to the system at this time.
And in addition to the war in Ukraine, let's talk about some of the other drivers of global hunger worldwide. Climate-induced shocks.
Climate and conflict really have been, and people were still, I think, we feel so far past it, but a lot of people were still recovering from all of the disruptions of COVID. So you had kind of a slower recovery happening. But climate, the Horn of Africa, we've seen record droughts, and we're still fighting near famine conditions in the Horn of Africa, but then also major flooding in places like Pakistan. So it's all over the place in terms of disasters. And then the other piece around conflict is that when there are these types of disruptions to food supplies and basic needs, it gives a lot of opportunity for bad actors to step in and take advantage of that situation. And so there were already stresses on the system. I think the other stress that we can't forget is, like, already there were a lot of places like Yemen that were just reliant on food, heavily reliant on food aid and foreign aid. A lot of foreign assistance has been diverted to Ukraine, and serving a major humanitarian catastrophe in Europe is a very expensive endeavor. And so the U.S. has been almost heroic in stepping up to support to support the needs of people beyond Ukraine and continuing to fund critical anti-hunger things. But a lot of other donors kind of vanished from a lot of other places that were still in very tenuous situations. So that's what the humanitarian community we always worry about donor fatigue, but it's just, there's this sense that there's so much going on top of Sudan recently in need, and governments are either distracted or trying to come out of their own financial woes.
Now, the numbers are worrying. The UN said just this month that last year, up to 783 million people worldwide were facing hunger. That's more than 122 million more people than in 2019, so before the pandemic. But those numbers obviously represent individuals, and I want to make sure we put a very human face to global hunger. Can you talk about some of the people that you've met in your travels to Mercy Corps sites worldwide, particularly in countries where they're facing food insecurity?
Thank you. That's the most important piece. So about 3 weeks after Russia invaded Ukraine, I went to Poland to see some of the relief work at the border, and then I went from there to Lebanon. Lebanon was already in the midst of a major economic crisis. A lot of people, in fact, some of our programming was helping people who'd had to return to their kind of farmland country, helping them learn how to farm. People who had been graphic designers, or like any of us in this room, having to go back and kind of farm their food and figure out how to survive. And in those weeks since the invasion of Ukraine, the price of bread and sunflower oil and basics had skyrocketed. So some people, I met a woman who had just started a business like exporting not a dairy product and like selling it to people in town and doing things. And all of a sudden the cost of her supplies had skyrocketed. So just that additional stress on where's this money going to come from. And a stress to the system, because Lebanon imported 80% of its wheat from Ukraine, and they had no storage because of the port bombing, right? So it just was this real looming catastrophe and fear ahead. Fast forward a few months later, I went to Somalia, which was already in the midst of a crippling drought, and it was actually, it's hard to even talk about. These families had to come from rural areas. Most of them are pastoralists, right? So they'd lost all their livestock. Everything was decimated. And at that point, when there was absolutely nothing, these families were walking for days, up to a week, 2 weeks, to outskirts of towns to get food. And more than a few people that I met had stories of like losing children along the way and having to bury those children on roads. And for those of us who are old enough to remember those images from the 80s of like USAID for Africa, it was the first time on such a scale I'd seen that many people across all age spectrums just obviously starving. Yeah. I visited a feeding hospital, so the worst cases are able to go get support. And there were multiple babies at 2 years old who were under 7 pounds, which is just frightful to think of. And the doctor was telling me that what was happening was that when they were giving these like ready-to-eat therapeutic foods, it's like a peanut butter paste, that the mothers were eating a little bit themselves, right? And then feeding the acutely ill child, but then trying to save some to take back home to the rest of the kids, right? Because these also tend to be larger families in pastoralist communities who were hungry, but not on the brink of death, like the child. And it was just very striking because, like I said, the U.S. really was the only major donor that was really stepping in, and yet you could see a shortage of availability and a lot of people just trying to survive. And while images of babies having a hard time, it's also heartbreaking. I saw like 70, 80, or at least they probably looked aged because of the old men, right, who just couldn't even move. And there really was very little available for adult feeding. So it just, Yes, there are real lives behind these things and real consequences, and particularly with young children, that level of starvation at a very young age when the brain is forming leads to irreversible stunting and wasting damage. It has been like kind of watching a generation really suffer unnecessarily.
That's devastating, but thank you for sharing, because I think it's really important to this conversation. Switching gears to solutions, because of the sheer scale of the global hunger crisis, particularly now, I think the rhetoric outside of humanitarian circles is often focused on emergency responses.
Yes.
But I know that groups like Mercy Corps and a lot of other groups that are doing this kind of work are also thinking about longer-term solutions.
Yes.
Can you talk about some of the things that you all are doing and also what is working worldwide?
Yeah, unfortunately it's a chicken and egg, because the thing that get a lot of funding for emergencies comes through supplementals, right? And so the thing that gets attention is the thing knocking at the door. But I think the number, it's like 6 times more expensive to be intervening when it's at the door than before. And so for the past, before COVID, before the crisis, the US government had been investing in Feed the Future in kind of long-term agricultural development in these places, trying to hit the last mile. And I shudder to think how much worse the numbers would be if those investments weren't happening. Like, providing that resilience to communities for them to help themselves has been quite important. So we are advocating for that. Obviously, it's very tense times with budgets. We're just hoping that we're working on the Farm Bill to make sure things don't go backwards, right? There have been, there's a small piece of the Farm Bill that's around international emergency and non-emergency food aid. And we're also trying to do things to help us a little bit with efficiency, like relaxing some of the requirements that 50% that the food has to go through US flagged ships, like things to kind of help us do more with our money faster in the near term, while also encouraging that investment in some of these systems short term, so that people don't have to be walking days to cities on the outskirts, so that they have other means of supporting themselves.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the Farm Bill in particular. Can you talk, I mean, you started to talk about it a little bit, but how important is the programs that the Farm Bill helps fund? How important are those programs for your work?
The programs that the Farm Bill helps fund, Food for Peace and the McGovern-Dole school feeding, it keeps millions of people alive in places like Yemen and Guatemala and some of the stands. And so that work is very important. And the way that work is structured, it's a lot of U.S. food commodities, but there also has been flexibility built in to do like the wraparound services like nutrition or farming support, so that people aren't reliant on those commodities forever. And so it's quite important. There are some minor things we can be doing to make that even more effective, but it's even more important that there's not a step backwards, right? Or that, some of this funding isn't cut or other restrictions put on it that make it even more difficult to use.
Right. And I want to hopefully end on a little bit of hope. We've seen in the past that we've made significant progress when it comes to global hunger. And unfortunately, a lot of that was derailed by the pandemic and now the war in Ukraine. But that said, do you have any hope? And are there lessons to learn, sort of quickly, because we only have a minute left?
No, I do have a lot of hope, exactly for the reasons that you said. About a decade ago, we were even talking about eradicating hunger, right? Like, we were making so much progress. Like, there are things that are tested and true that are working, investments we're making that are working, and I do think there is room to change this mindset of emergency versus development to kind of to help really ease the pain of the emergency side. So I'm hopeful. I despite everything, I am still hopeful.
That's great to hear.
Okay.
Jada, thank you so much for your insight.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah,
Thank
we
you.
really appreciate you.
Up next, our view from the top moderator and Axios publisher, Nicholas Johnston.
Thank you all for being here this morning. Nothing that we do at Axios is possible without the support of our partners. All the investments that we make in journalism, events like this, the growth that we've had around the world and around the country. A huge shout out to our Axios local team. We're in our 30th city as of this week in San Diego. So if you're in town from out of town, go to signup.axios.com and look for some of the newsletters that we have that you might be able to sign up for. And of course, today's conversation would not be possible without the support of the World Food Program USA. We're very grateful for them making this conversation possible. And they actually went the extra mile for this one. I usually don't give this kind of spiel at an event, but they brought so much to the table today. We have up there on the touch screen in the back of the room a way to learn more about composting in the District of Columbia and surrounding cities. I'm actually just signed up for the program here in the District of Columbia, waiting on my box to start composting. The food here has been sourced, all from local vendors. All of them are waste conscious, and you may have picked up the piece of paper with the QR code and thought, this feels strange. It's embedded with seeds, so take it into your backyard, water it a little bit, and soon you'll have a flower garden. So we've got a fully immersive virtual and physical experience here thanks to the World Food Program USA. And so I'm very happy to welcome up to the stage the program's president and CEO, Baron Seeger. Baron, welcome to Axios. Thanks so much for being here.
Absolutely.
Oh, bring it in. All right. Let's start big picture. Give us a sense of what is the state from your vantage point of the hunger and food crisis around the world.
So, Nicholas, I would say today hunger is at our doorstep. There's a great sense of urgency. It's literally outrageous that today I have to let you know that 345 million people around the world are what we call food insecure, don't know where their next meal is going to come from. And 43 million people are marching toward famine. Famine, if you don't have food, you're going to die. These are 43 million individuals who are literally on the verge of death.
Those are massive, huge numbers. And it's a sense I think for me, it's not in the headlines every day, right? With that many millions, hundreds of millions of people facing that kind of severe crisis, not in the headlines every day. Why is that? And can you talk a little bit, we talked a little bit about polling beforehand, where you're sort of able to understand how people view this as an issue and a crisis.
Well, a couple things. We just did a Harris poll study, and what we learned was significant because it told us that the number one issue on the minds of people in the United States is hunger. Whether you are a young person, a teenager, you're in your 20s, 30s, or you're in your 60s. And we have certain drivers of hunger. We know that a big driver is cost. And it's interesting, Jada mentioned Lebanon. I was in Lebanon as well.
Right.
And when you think about inflation here in the U.S., 3% over the last year, in Lebanon, the annual inflation rate is 254%. So it becomes an issue of affordability.
And that kind of inflation rate and those kinds of crises, driven by international crises, the war in Ukraine, those are driven down in food costs by of course, the most vulnerable by almost definition, right?
Well, conflict is the number one driver of hunger. We have farmland that's now being used as battlefields. Our ports are being blocked, and food is used as a weapon of war today. It's just absolutely unacceptable. And the main individual groups that are left the most vulnerable are women and children, and that's absolutely outrageous and unacceptable.
So even though it doesn't feel like it's in the headlines every day, you've talked about the polling data, and then you have over 100,000 engaged donors. You've 10x'd your fundraising in the last year to almost $200 million. That's somewhat of a hopeful sign, but what more is needed? That's just probably a piece of the puzzle.
So we have to really rely on, I would say, keep our foot on the gas. We can't let up. We have to remember that, until 2015, hunger was on the decline. And unfortunately, we have three things that are happening right now all together at the same time. And that's costs going up, it's conflict, and it's climate. And all three of those are driving hunger. And so the goal is that we're all in this together. So from our policymakers, which I know this is about today, we have to make sure that our legislators make hunger the top priority, that they fund the World Food Program at the full extent. And then, as you mentioned, the private sector, very grateful for partnerships like the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I know Mars is in the audience today as well, but very grateful and humbled, to be honest with you, that so many philanthropists have identified the World Food Program and hunger as the first line of defense.
Right. But there's probably a reason we're holding this event in Washington while Congress is in session, and hopefully a lot of folks who are really interested in the policy are in the room. Like, what is the message you'd want to give to them as far as, like, even with the success from the private sector, there has to be a public part
Well,
of it.
it's going to take us a while to build to that $1 billion mark globally in the private sector, and we need our policymakers to make sure that nobody starves to death. Last year, the World Food Program received a $5 billion supplemental. And by the way, that allowed us to avert famine. That's a huge accomplishment. But the problem is that this year, we're seeing declines in funding overall, which means that rations are being cut. And I would hate to be that mother or that father that has to decide which child eats and which child doesn't eat. I mean, it's such an awful situation that I don't want any parent to have to make.
Right, and it's not a decision. It's not an issue of like, well, we funded it last year, we fixed it. No, this is an ongoing crisis where, like, each year we're still building a response to as well.
So there's a legacy here. Since World War II, the U.S. government has been, and I'm again very grateful for this. The U.S. government has been the main contributor to the World Food Program. That has allowed us to make sure that we're doing two things: that we are providing cash assistance where possible. Also, we have an amazing relationship with American farmers. Millions of tons of produce grown here in the United States are also shipped to countries that are landlocked, don't have the ability of growing their own food. So I would say, Nicholas, to your question, there's a legacy since World War II, but we can't take our foot off the accelerator. This is not the time to slow down.
Right. So, I mean, like, the United States has traditionally played a leadership role in that. Like, why is that, and how do you how do you hope to continue that? Like, what is the message you would probably bring to say, like, don't step back from that?
Well, the message is the implication. So, if the U.S. government were to reduce their commitments to the World Food Program, the impact is probably fivefold. So, we know that when people are hungry, communities are destabilized. War breaks out. The most vulnerable suffer, particularly women and children. And so, again, food is looked as a destabilizing force throughout the world, and we can't reduce the funding for the World Food Program, or humans will suffer and countries will become destabilized.
Right. I think that's a key point you mentioned. Is like it's the first of maybe a cascading series of dominoes that just lead not just to hunger, but to failed states and to conflicts and to crisis around the globe as well. This can be a somewhat bit of a downer to talk about. So I'd love to flip this a little bit. So, like at Axios, we love to end on one fun thing. Here I really like to think about one hopeful thing. And so now that you've outlined the problem, you've outlined what lies ahead of us, I wonder if you could let us walk off the stage with somewhat of a hopeful note of what are the types of things that are working, what makes you optimistic?
So there are a lot of exciting things happening around food and agriculture. One is, we talked about the private sector. The private sector is now working with the World Food Program to use assets, experience to help us do better, to help us create technologies to make farming more sustainable. We recognize that climate is changing the world, so we also recognize that we have to rely on our own technologies. We have an innovation accelerator that is always looking at how do we develop, how do we deploy new technologies to do things differently, so that smallholder farmers, for example, can grow different types of crops, they can do the inventory, they can take their products to the market. And I would say that I've seen countless success stories, particularly of female smallholder farmers that are creating a level of sustainability. And one quick story I would tell you: when I was in Central America, we were working with some smallholder farmers, and I saw this group of teenagers that were kind of looking, saying, who are these strange people from the World Food Program? And I walked over, because that's kind of what I do to people on the street, walked over, and I said, hey, I'm just curious, have your friends migrated to the U.S., and if so, what keeps you here? And this group of teenagers, boys and girls, about 15 to 17 years old, they said, yes, we have had friends who have migrated, but we're staying here because through the World Food Program and its partners, we have jobs, we have income, and we don't want to leave our families. So what I was really humbled with was the fact that through the World Food Program, opportunities were being created so that people didn't feel so desperate. Let's remember, migration it's when people become so desperate, whether it's violence or lack of food, that they can't stay in their communities anymore. Right. So our job is to do everything we can do to keep people in their communities sustaining and surviving.
I mean, that kind of talks to the interconnectedness that we can leave on, which I think is a great big picture to come back to it, is where it's not just food policy, it's climate policy, it's conflict policy, it's migration policy. And if you can solve the hunger issue at the start, the knock-on effects can be enormous.
And I would add, since I know today we're talking about the policymakers and the impact on contributions to food, one example I would give you is the McGovern-Dole school feeding program. I mean, last year the World Food Program fed 15 million school children. So I use that as an example, as a success story, because the funding is given to local communities. They're growing their own food. The families are involved in making sure things are cooked, and they're also very healthy meals. But imagine that 15 million school children are in school learning and having that ability to succeed. So I am very proud of the work that the World Food Program is doing through the McGovern-Dole school feeding program to allow 15 million kids to get fed. I know when I was in school, I was always thinking about my stomach and how hungry I was. And so I've visited numerous school feeding programs, and I've seen what it does on the human body, but also what it does particularly to young girls, allowing them a chance to succeed.
That's great. I think that's a great hopeful note to end on. Baron, thanks for making this to us.
Thank you.
Thanks to the World Food Program USA for being here as well. Baron, thanks a lot.
Thanks, buddy.
Introducing Axios senior politics reporter Eugene Scott.
Good morning, and thank you so much for joining us. And we're going to continue this conversation with Michigan Senator Debbie Stabenow.
It's good to be here.
I think this is your first time joining us since announcing your retirement.
I think so, yeah, although it doesn't feel like it. I'm running through the tape. It's the end of next year, and it hasn't slowed down a bit.
It has not. It has not. Since we have you here, what do you think Dems need to do to keep this seat?
Well, we just need to do what I've always done, which is work hard, represent Michigan, know Michigan, and we will keep the seat. We have great candidates running. So
awesome. Before we pivot, do you want to make an endorsement on?
Well, I am not. I've never endorsed in a Democratic primary, but we've got great people.
Awesome. I had to ask.
You had to ask.
I had to ask.
I know.
So this is a very important conversation that I know is dear to you. You are chair of the Senate Committee on Agriculture and Nutrition.
Yep, Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry Committee.
And so this will be your last Farm Bill, the 2023 Farm Bill. What are your priorities for it?
Well, first let me say, and this really makes me feel like I've been around here a long time, I've been involved in 6 farm bills. The first one was when I was in the House, and third one that I've led. And so it's very important, obviously, that we maintain a robust safety net for families around food and nutrition. And so, and of course, internationally, which is even a bigger issue now with what is happening. But the nutrition program is very important. We have exciting things happening working with farmers in voluntary conservation efforts that are very specific to tackling the climate crisis. So we've added dollars there. Our farmers are very interested. They're on the front lines. Nobody is hit harder on the climate crisis than farmers and what's happening to the weather and so on. So the ability to do practices that keep carbon in the ground, that mitigate methane and so on are very important for all of us. And we've added funding through the Inflation Reduction Act that helps farmers do that. So that's important. And then just overall, we have prices go up, down, trade issues up, down. It's really important. We have a farm safety net that we focus on trade, bioenergy. There are 12 different titles in the Farm Bill, and they are all very important. It's actually a huge 5-year set of policies that's economic development in rural communities. It's everything we do for quality of life in rural communities. But I've also added Office of Urban Agriculture, which has become more important. And certainly we saw during the pandemic, local food systems, small farms, regional farms, local food systems, it's jobs, it's access to healthy food and so on. So it's a huge set of policies.
It sounds it. So
it is.
So what do you foresee being the biggest obstacle in getting this legislation passed?
Well, this is always bipartisan, and usually the biggest issues are by region, not party. It's like, what do you grow? And then so people come in, they want to focus on livestock, or they want to focus on, traditional crops, or they want to focus on fruits and vegetables or something. So there's all of that. There's always, unfortunately, politics around nutrition. There shouldn't be. I think we should be proud as a country that we help people reduce hunger. $6 a day is what the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program provides to folks that need it. 80% of that goes to seniors, people with disabilities, families with children, veterans. But $6 a day to help folks not starve in our country. And I think we should actually be very proud of that we provide that. But the politics around that, always get very difficult. The biggest thing is that we have a very new Congress, mostly House, but some Senate, and we have actually 260 people who've never voted on a farm bill. They haven't been here 5 years. Some have barely been here 5 months. And so we are educating my office. We're putting out what we call Farm Bill 101 on each of the titles. This is the rural development title and what it does. This is the nutrition title and what it does. And so because it is complicated. And so we have a lot of work to do just to explain why it's important to do these things.
Can you give us 2 points from Farm Bill 101 that you think most people don't know?
Well, the Farm Bill is the largest investment in land and water conservation we make in our country. Largest. Any private land. So we have public forests, public land, any private land. The policies for protecting land and water go through the Farm Bill. The other thing is this is a jobs bill. For rural communities. This is about investing. Rural development helps small businesses, helps our schools and hospitals, and when we talk about rural broadband and telehealth and all of the things, in addition to the importance of our farmers, bioenergy. There's a whole bunch of things that we do with bio-based products that people don't know. For example, if you are in, I'll now do, we make cars in Michigan, so we make things and grow things, but it comes together around bio-based products. If you're in a Ford vehicle, chances are, if you purchase it in the last number of years, you are sitting in soy-based foam in the seats. Lear makes sustainable soy-based foam. And so it's better for the environment. If you get hungry, you've got something to eat, And but the corn byproducts are in the plastic in the cup holders or the front of the vehicle. There's all kinds of things. They're working on a soy-based tire that is is exactly like the rubber that you see. It's just not petroleum. It is bio-based. So from fuel, like ethanol, biodiesel, to bio-based products, that's jobs in rural America. So my Make It Here, Grow It Here initiative, we put in the Farm Bill a few years ago, and we're trying to really continue to create jobs from those initiatives.
Awesome. So that's stateside. The Farm Bill does a lot globally. I know you were part of the first all-women's Codel to Africa, Tanzania, Senegal. What did you learn?
Ethiopia.
Like Ethiopia. Yeah. What did you learn being on the ground, seeing what this Farm Bill does outside of the States?
What we do internationally is really important. It makes a huge difference. I did organize, as chair of the Agriculture Committee, the first all-women senators trip, Codel, for 10 days in Africa. We looked at a lot of different food programs, Food for Peace, the Food for Progress program. We do so much with commodities that are important, as well as other flexibility, non-emergency feeding programs. The McGovern-Dole program for children in schools, seen that in Africa, also in Haiti. What that does, I mean, we have over 30 million children that have been fed in 48 countries because of that program. And now when we see what is happening just recently with the Black Sea Initiative and what Putin is doing to use food as a weapon. Stalin did this in the 30s, and now we're back to I don't have words for how bad this is. And so now we have to, again, and the World Food Program, so appreciative of what's happening here today with the World Food Programs and sponsoring this. And the fact, and the new executive director, Cindy McCain, who is incredibly respected in what she's speaking out about what they need right now, we need to respond to that. So we're working on a supplemental, and there's bipartisan support to move forward and do something. It really needs to be done quickly. I mean, we're talking about millions and millions and millions of people starving around the world. And the United States has an important role, not the only role, but a very important role in being able to address it.
Talk about that a bit. I mean, there are many Americans, many lawmakers on the other side of the aisle who do believe that the U.S. should play a smaller role in addressing involved in globalization. What would you say to anyone, voters in particular from Michigan, who would say, I don't know that many of our tax dollars need to be invested in addressing issues in Haiti and Ethiopia?
Well, first of all, just from a numbers standpoint, it's not a large percentage of our tax dollars. It never has been. When people have said to me, you could balance the budget, reduce the deficit by cutting international programs, you know, you're talking 1%, 2%. I mean, of the budget, it's very small amount. But how do we say we're the greatest country in the world and not step up and be a part of addressing the major humanitarian crises of the world? How do we say that? How do we do that? If we're the greatest country in the world, and I believe that we are, then we have a moral, ethical responsibility to not turn a blind eye to what is happening. Now, it's not just from a humanitarian standpoint. This is in our national interest. Food security is national security. But the combination of what Putin is doing in Ukraine, coupled with the climate crisis, people can't grow food. What happens when people are hungry? What happens when they can't grow food? And then they are coming to our borders, and then everybody talks about the border crisis. But we're not dealing with the major issue, which is the fact that people don't have food. And so whether it is the despicable efforts of Putin, whether it's the climate crisis, whether it's other things happening, unrest around the world, food becomes a major part of creating stability. So it's not only emergency spending, it's helping local economies. We have one of the 5 things in our Farm Bill is the Farmer to Farmer program, which is volunteers that go to other countries that will help them develop their own sustainable food systems, which is very important as well. I mean, most of the economies of the world are in agriculture. And so, which is why, by the way, climate policies affecting agriculture are more significant than people think, because so much of the world's economy is in agriculture. Managing forests, managing crops, what do we do to keep carbon in the ground? But this is national security. It's in our interest for people to feel secure in their own country. And so,
well, we know you have your hands in quite a few things. In addition to the Farm Bill, what are some of your other priorities in this final year you have in Congress?
well, I have many priorities. I always start with, we make things and grow things in Michigan. So I'm deeply involved in agriculture and deeply involved in manufacturing. We have a manufacturing renaissance going on. I have to tell you, I'm very excited about what is happening under President Biden. It is literally true that we've created 23 million or 13 million new jobs, and we are bringing back advanced manufacturing in this country. We're making things in America. So I'm very involved in electric vehicles and, pushing us forward. The other area of passion for me is around healthcare and mental health. I was with the president yesterday announcing some initiatives at the White House, building on something that is a bipartisan initiative that Senator Roy Blunt, who just retired last year, he and I have worked on for 10 years, which is funding community mental health care like physical health care. And so we have created community behavioral health clinics that will be getting full Medicaid support in the community, not stop and start grants. If you've worked in this area at all, it's, everything stop and start grants for mental health or addiction. This is healthcare money, comprehensive clinics. In Michigan, where we have 34 of them now, a third of the folks that walk in the clinic get seen the same day. Anybody can get help, and everybody has to be served within 10 days. So we were celebrating this. We have 500 clinics across the country. The president signed a national effort as part of the gun bill, the Safer Communities Act, to be expanding this effort under Medicaid, but it's transformational what is happening. And yesterday, the president announced another piece, which is on the insurance end. If you have insurance right now, insurance companies are supposed to fund behavioral health like physical health, not requiring more paperwork, not limiting the number of sessions you can have. They're not supposed to be able to say you can have 8 sessions if a therapist, but if you have cancer treatments, it's unlimited. It's supposed to be the same. I made mental health services an essential benefit under the Affordable Care Act when we did it, but unfortunately, the insurance companies are not doing this. So the president has put forward a rule that will make sure that we are covering health care above the neck, the same as health care below the neck. So.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that all with us. Hopefully we can get you back here before you leave Washington. Awesome. Thank you for having our guests.
Thank you.
Welcoming to the stage Axios politics reporter Sophia Cox.
Okay, we have one last guest. He is another leader on food and ag issues in the Senate, Senator Jerry Moran of Kansas. Senator, thank you. Thanks for being here with us. Senate Hunger Caucus.
Yes, ma'am.
Tell us about how you got involved, now you're leading it, and what you all are up to.
It's actually been a long history. I co-chaired the House Hunger Caucus in my days as a House member, and sought out those responsibilities when I came to the Senate now 13 years ago. A bit of a, I don't know, it's not a midlife crisis because I'm still not at my midlife, but at some point in my time in Congress, I decided I wanted to be something that had long-lasting value, wanted a cause that added meaning to my life and made a difference in other people's lives. And hunger became somewhat of an obvious one. Kansas is a place that I represent. Kansas is a place that not only has a long history of leadership in hunger issues, Senator Dole in particular, what we call Dole McGovern, what sometimes is referred to as McGovern-Dole. And we also have the hometown of President Eisenhower, who signed into law Food for Peace. And we raise a lot of agriculture commodities. We produce a lot of food. And I've tried to take out a niche in this topic. And while many people work on various aspects of hunger, one of the things I try to make sure we don't lose sight of is that science and technology have the capability of increasing productivity and better enable us to feed hungry people around the globe. So it's become an interest. It became an interest of mine a long time ago, and we've tried to live up to the legacy and create opportunities for Kansans to participate in. I always tell farmers from my state and across the country, what you do is very noble. Feeding people has a real value, a real benefit. And as I've been in the Senate longer, I've become a bit more engaged, and I'm a defense appropriator. I'm a member of the Senate Committee on Intelligence. And there's also this national security aspect.
Yep,
this
and I want to get
as well.
to that a little later. Don't worry, we can call it Dole McGovern. How's that?
All right, at least for this morning.
In your state, I know there's been a drought in western Kansas. You know, how would something like a drought affect food supply? And what are you and your colleagues in the Senate doing to prepare for more of these extreme weather events?
Well, I mean, again, it perhaps in part goes back to science and technology, the ability to grow and produce drought-resistant crops. I think there's plenty of evidence that the weather patterns are different from today than when I was a kid. My daughters have never seen snow piled to the rooftops. That's what I grew up with in western Kansas. The moisture situation is certainly different, but it's also dramatically changing. We're now having significant rains. There's been flooding in towns that have had year-long drought with water now going down the street. So it is this significant challenge that farmers face. In fact, what's happening in Kansas today is that we're still trying to harvest wheat, which should have been done weeks ago. And the rains have come and makes it impossible to get into the fields. The weeds are growing, and it makes it now a challenge to plant fall crops. So at a time in which the world needs more food, Kansas and much of the Midwest is struggling to produce even the amount of food that we traditionally, historically do. So it's a recognition that science and technology can be of help to us in determining how to better rotate our crops, what crops we should grow, and to use hybrids and research to make certain that we get it right.
Yeah, I recently heard of something called hydroponic farming, but we won't get into that. On the issue of Russia pulling out of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, I mean, this has been one of the most kind of essential, but also, devastating issues when it comes to global hunger. Tell us why that's important and what the U.S. should be doing about that.
So, look, this is catastrophic. The world's in a very difficult and challenging place in regard to the fragility of people's ability to feed themselves and their families. We need every opportunity we can to produce and to export and to trade and to sell and to give food around the globe. You highlighted the challenges that we face in the United States based upon lower production. I think the wheat harvest in Kansas this year is expected to be the least number of bushels harvested since 1960. So at a time in which the world needs more, there's challenges in the United States to fill that gap. And just like Kansas and the Midwest of our state is the breadbasket of this part of the world, Ukraine and Russia is the breadbasket of that part of the world, and particularly in Asia, Afghanistan, Africa, Northern Africa, what is produced in that region, in Ukraine and Russia, is the huge provider of sustenance for people in that part of the world. Putin's invasion of Ukraine is a terrible circumstance. It's unjustified, it's illegal, it's immoral. You add to this now Putin's refusal to allow grain to be shipped. My takeaway is this, that America and the West, our allies, ought to be highlighting this action by President Putin, by Russia. There are lots of countries in the world who have taken a more neutral view toward the Russian invasion of Ukraine than many European and Western countries. It is a time to highlight for the world what the challenges we now face as a result of not just the invasion of Ukraine, but specifically the inability to feed people in the world because of an action by one leader of a country. And so we ought to be using the moral platform. We ought to be using the public relations opportunities to highlight and point the finger, and hopefully not just for purposes of East-West kind of battles, but for the purposes of getting Vladimir Putin to change the policy or to find a path out of what he has said and do it in a different way. I also would add that the United States, there was a Wall Street Journal editorial a few days or weeks ago about escorting ships. We need to figure out whether that makes sense or whether that escalates the war. The other thing is we need to see what additional efforts can be made in regard to land routes.
So it's not just other world leaders who are, refusing to condemn Putin. It's also been some of your other colleagues in your party. I mean, just look at who's running for president. Is it difficult to do the work that you're doing when it comes to these issues when there are other very loud members of your party who are, singing a different tune? They're becoming more isolationist.
Well, I don't know whether there's any members of the Senate who would any way suggest that what Putin's doing in starving the world, that part of this, is anything that anyone would be saying is okay. There are members of Congress, of the Senate and the House, who are opposed or are unsupportive of our efforts to assist Ukraine. I'm pretty straightforward in this topic. I think there's a moral and a national security objective that can be achieved here. And if you have people who are interested in protecting and defending their own freedoms and liberties, that America, the United States of America, ought to be an ally in that effort. And we ought to make certain that we do things better, faster, quicker, and more helpful to Ukraine. The last thing that would suggest we would ever have success in this effort is a day-by-day, week-by-week, month-by-month slog that has no outcome evident. And so we've got to be aggressive and helpful quickly, and we can't linger as we watch to see. We were slow getting to the United States, was slow in my view in getting there, and I assume that in the beginning people thought, policymakers and people thought that there was no chance that Ukraine could win. They've demonstrated that they have a chance to have success, and we ought to be there in support. We need to bring the rest of the world to that position. And I'll work to bring, I doubt that I'm going to be successful, but I'm happy to try to make the case to my colleagues and others. We had a vote on the Senate floor. This issue was overwhelmingly supported by Republicans and Democrats. The vote occurred last week. There were 13 Republicans who voted no funding for the efforts in Ukraine. But that's not a majority position, and it's certainly in the Senate. It doesn't take 60 votes.
Right. What would you say to Americans who, whether it's global hunger or other issues around the world, who may not care about what's going on in other countries unless it directly affects them? What would you say to former President Trump or, Ron DeSantis or Vivek Ramaswamy? And then they all have softer stances when it comes to Ukraine. And I know that you are in support of the supplemental funding, humanitarian aid, but what would you say to those Americans and those leaders in your party?
A great thing about hunger aid and support for ending hunger in the world is that I love these issues that you could make the case is do this for your own self-interest. If you care about the United States of America, you should be supporting the efforts to feed the world. If you want to narrow it and just talk about yourselves, then do something for yourself and feed the world because it makes us safer, makes us more secure, It provides us with allies. And it gives us markets and consumption of the things that we grow in the United States. It helps our economy. But if you want to take another step, and my view is I'm of the view that both of these things matter, just if you want to be moral, if you want to say there's something about being right and being wrong, be on the side of being right, and you will reach the conclusion that it's your job as a human being. I just was visiting with the president, and he was telling me that the private sector is stepping up, and a significant portion of the private sector is faith-based organizations in the United States and around the globe. It is time to applaud people who say because we have a religious belief, because we have morals, because we have faith, we're interested in helping other men and women created by God. Feeding people is a noble, moral, faith-based issue. It's also beneficial to the United States of America as a country.
Yeah, and I should add to your point that Senate ag appropes just passed through $1.8 billion for Food for Peace, and also $250 million for the Dole McGovern program. So that's sort of the other side of it, is that in fact the appropriations is going through.
So I would say on that topic, and essentially Senator Dole's 100th birthday was Saturday. We celebrated it in Kansas. Secondly, one of the things, if you're asking what you can do to help address these issues, one of the important things is you just highlighted that with the budget constraints that we have that have been agreed to by the president and by the Speaker of the House, with that restriction on how much money can be spent, we're a little more than flat funding the food, McGovern Dole and Food for Peace, which I would say is a victory in today's circumstance. But what would defeat all of that is an inability of Congress to pass appropriation bills and end up with a continuing resolution, or in a time in which that means nothing is improved. Even the flat line is a problem. So we need to make certain, and I think on Friday, the Senate Appropriations Committee will pass the last 4. This is my view. I'll be there, and I think we'll pass the last 4 appropriation bills. So for the first time in 5 years, all 12 appropriation bills will be ready for the Senate floor. The question is, can we reconcile the House and the Senate and avoid a continuing resolution in the future? And it's difficult to predict, but if you want to make a case for something that's important, make sure we don't fall back to a continuing resolution if you care about these issues, but really if you care about almost everything related to the United States.
Mm-hmm. You're going to have to let me go off topic for one question, because I've been covering the campaigns. Who do you support in the Republican primaries for president?
Well, I have an easy answer, because as long as I've been a candidate, I've never endorsed anyone for any office, at least.
Who do you like?
I've tried it. That's a different question. I used to be able to say that, well, Kansans, we have Mike Pompeo, and so I'm waiting to see what my fellow Kansan does. But he's taken that opportunity away from me by declining to run. But I'm a Tim Scott fan. He's my friend, and I have great confidence in his capabilities and particularly his moral values and who he is as a human being. So there's no earth-shattering kind of a pronouncement here, and no one would necessarily find my suggestion or choice for who should be president, that kind of thing anyway. But I'm anxious for us to work our way through the political process and hopefully have two or more great candidates running for president who would either one who would lead the country in the right direction, and I hope we get through that process in that way.
In Axios fashion, you told me you had 5 big things that you wanted to end on.
Well, we've talked about most of them, but in preparing for this, this was useful to me because it caused me to sit down and think about what it is we should be doing. And these were my 5 takeaways, which I came up independently from Axios's 5 big things. But the Black Sea Grain Initiative is really a front and center issue. It's critically timely. And again, we need to make a decision if there's something that we can do to open up other routes, something we can do to get support, escorts for ships getting in and out. I just heard from Samantha Powers this week. She's been to Odessa. I'm anxious to have a conversation with her to find out what USAID and others are thinking that we might do. And on top of that, let's bring world opinion in favor of an opportunity to export Ukrainian and Russian grain. Let's bring it to the forefront with Putin. That's number one. Dole, McGovern, and Food for Peace. I mentioned this. The appropriations process has to work if any of the modest victories that we have are going to be maintained. There's something flashing over here. And
Yes, it says wrap up.
but that's only two. Emergency supplemental. The Hunger Caucus, we're in the effort of, once again, we did this after the problems, the challenges in Afghanistan and hunger there, in requesting by letter to the president additional money and supplemental aid for hunger and humanity issues. And we I think we'll be successful in getting a significant number of our colleagues to sign on to that. So an emergency supplemental becomes hugely important in the future. And I didn't mention this one, Feed the Future. It is, we're in a crisis situation, but we also got to know that we have a long-term plan, and using science and technology around the globe with our universities is important. And finally, I'd say to the people in the audience and to my colleagues in the Senate, we just need to lead and to encourage and have hope and to provide hope. Hunger and food is a way that you can change people's lives. And hope is the greatest thing we have to offer people. So let's as Americans, as human beings, let's lead and let's provide hope and optimism for the future.
Thank
That's
you
my five.
so much.
All right, thank you.
Sincerest
thanks, everybody.
I'd like to thank our sponsor, World Food Program USA, for making this possible. Thanks for those of you who came out today. Thanks for those of you who tuned in virtually. With that, see you next time. Thank you.
0-0. I don't know how soon it got there.